Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to representation in Quality Street Advert, which is a set text at GCSE. If you're interested in the media language part of this question, there is a separate video for that, but this video is going to be focused on representation. Now, it's important to remember that representation is very neatly tied in with media language. You're going to need to understand the media language to be able to answer the representation questions. So please make sure you watch that video if you haven't done so already. So on your screen now you can see a list of the things the exam board say that you need to understand in order to be able to answer representation questions about Quality Street in the GCSE Media Studies exam. If you have a look at the advert, you will see that there are 3 women and 2 men on the advert, and it's important to be able to look at all of them when making judgments about representations. If we start with the main man at the central portion of the advert, the one in the suit, we need to think about how he's been represented and whether this is typical of the way men are often represented in media products or not. He has a suit on and a tie. He looks pretty powerful as well. He's in the centre of the image, so his positioning makes him seem powerful, as well as the fact that all of the other characters are pointed towards him adds to his status. The suit and tie suggest that perhaps he is somebody who works, perhaps also quite wealthy as well. And so we can tell quite a lot about him just by looking at him. This is a reasonably typical representation of men within the media, both in the 1950s and also in modern media as well. However, it definitely reflects the historical context, which is that time period it was made in, because the idea that men were the ones who went out to work and were seen as very important and powerful, particularly in comparison to women, that was a central idea in the 1950s. The man in the frame on the wall is dressed in a kind of red, black and gold soldier's outfit. Now that costume is not actually from the 1950s, it's from a time period that we call the Regency period. And that is much more old-fashioned, but it was a soldier's outfit, so it perhaps does represent men as being capable of physical activity, fighting, showing them as being strong and powerful. And so the representations of men in this advert are fairly typical. If you look at the women in the advert, the women on the sofa are facing the man. They are both kissing him and they are wearing what look like quite attractive, pretty, quite feminine style dresses that were very appropriate and popular in the 1950s. The fact that they aren't wearing business suits and ties might show and emphasise their femininity, and it might also reflect that time period as well, the historical context, showing the idea that women were perhaps expected to be beautiful and feminine and were not expected to go out into the place of work. So the women are shown in quite an old-fashioned, sweet, feminine, vulnerable way in comparison to the men. You need to be able to understand feminist theories at GCSE. Now, your teachers will have taught you perhaps different feminist theories depending on what school you're in. So if I mention a theorist and you don't know who I'm talking about, please don't panic. There are no named theorists for feminist theorists that you need to know at GCSE. It just says that you should know one at least. So I've taught my students about Van Zunen and Laura Mulvey. Van Zunen believes that women are often sexualised in the media, and if you have a look at these adverts, I would say that the women are not sexualised for the most part. They're wearing quite modest clothing, their outfits are not revealing, and the focus is not on their bodies. So they haven't been objectified or sexualised in the way that many modern adverts often do. This could be reflective of that historical time period. In the 1950s, women were still seen as needing to be quite modest, quite refined, and the sexualisation of women in the media and in society didn't really start happening until the following decade, which is the 1960s. Some people do argue that the women have been objectified slightly in that they are dressed a little bit like sweets, in stripes, in the colours of the sweets, so they look a bit like the brightly coloured sweet packets in the Quality Street tin itself, and that might suggest that they are also being seen as objects to choose from, particularly if you look at the image anchored with the text about a delicious dilemma, it suggests that perhaps the man is having to choose between not just the sweets but also the women. And so perhaps that is objectifying women and making them seem like something that is there just for the man's enjoyment. It's important that you can understand how those representations have been constructed through the use of media language. So that's things like the facial expression, the body language, colours, costumes, props, written language, camera angles. So check out the media language video on my YouTube channel for Quality Street if you haven't done so already, and that should give you some ideas of things you could say for that particular point. We've spoken about how historical context might have an impact on the representations in this advert. So the fact that it was made in the 1950s will have an impact on the way that women and men have been represented. However, there might be other reasons that we can look at for why these representations have been constructed this way. For example, the fact that this is an advert for a product like chocolates means that they are trying to sell something. And ultimately, when you do try and sell a product, representing your people or your characters in a particular way might help you to sell your products. Showing the man as successful, for example, and wealthy in his suit and tie with a choice of beautiful women surrounding him might be a good way of selling your product to the audience. It creates an aspirational image that audiences might want to achieve, and they think that by buying this tin of chocolates, they're also going to be able to achieve this amazing lifestyle. You could also discuss the fact that in the 1950s, the vast majority of media products like adverts were made by men. The media industry was dominated by men, and often still is in certain sectors, but certainly in the 1950s, because men were the ones expected to work and women were often expected to stay at home and take care of the household and the children, it was often men that made adverts like this. And certainly the Quality Street brand was owned by a male father and son. So it's highly likely that perhaps the people who owned this product and who therefore would have influenced the making of the advert might have been responsible for creating representations that they were familiar and comfortable with as men. You're also going to want to be able to understand how audiences might respond to the representations in this advert. And you need to think about audiences in the 1950s as well as modern audiences as well, because they may well respond differently. People in the 1950s may well have seen representations like this as being very, very common, with women being seen as vulnerable and feminine and pretty, and men being seen as powerful and strong or aggressive. And so if you have a look at a variety of adverts from the 1950s, representations like this wouldn't have seemed out of place at all. Audiences in the 1950s might therefore have seen this as being very familiar, recognisable. They would have enjoyed seeing these perfect people in their utopian lifestyle. And so perhaps in the 1950s, these representations wouldn't have seemed out of place and actually would have been very engaging. That doesn't mean to say modern audiences wouldn't enjoy these representations. Some audiences still enjoy seeing representations of men and women like this, and certainly men and women are still often represented in these ways in the media, particularly in the advertising industry. However, in the decades that have passed since the 1950s, we have moved on considerably. Women are often more sexualised in the media than they were many decades ago. And so representations now, we often expect to see women wearing much more revealing clothing, and the use of sexual body language or wording, the use of double entendres might have represented women now in adverts as being much more suggestive. There's been a big rise in feminism since the 1950s, and certainly there has been a move towards equality, although I can't say that we've achieved it completely yet. There is definitely the expectation now that we shouldn't necessarily see really old-fashioned gender stereotypes in the media, and certainly that's one of the new requirements of the Advertising Standards Authority, that adverts shouldn't just show old-fashioned gender stereotypes. So perhaps some modern audiences might see this advert as being very old-fashioned in terms of its gender stereotypes, with the man wearing his suit and the women wearing their perfect dresses. So some modern audiences might see this as perhaps a little bit sexist. It's important to remember that in the GCSE Media exam, if you get Quality Street as a representation question, it will be a longer question worth around 25 to 30 marks. It will be something you have to spend a considerable amount of time on, and it will be a comparison question in comparison to an unseen print advert that they will give you in the exam. So you need to get used to looking at other adverts, both historical and modern, and being able to see whether or not you can make comparisons between the representations of men and women in Quality Street in comparison to other adverts. And this is something you can do to practice and revise in your own time.